Therefore, hear this now, you who are given to pleasures, who dwell securely, and say in your heart, I am, and there is no one else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, nor shall I know the loss of children. But these two things shall come to you in a moment, in one day, the loss of children and widowhood, and they shall come upon you in their fullness, because of the multitude of your sorceries, and for the great abundance of your enchantments. Well, if you have your Bibles, you need them. You turn to the book of Lamentations, found after the book of Jeremiah. The book of Lamentations must be one of the most painful and pitiful pieces of literature ever written, no matter what history, language, or culture. And there's a reason for that. There are great atrocities that take place in the world today. If you read your newspaper, you will have an article of what's happening there in Gaza, for example. And what you'll find is that they'll write about the trauma of those waiting for food and water and being under bombing and all those things. And it'd be graphic, and it may even affect you while you read. But when you come to the book of Lamentations, there is something now which is even more pitiful and even more painful. Not because the atrocities may be, in one sense, they may be the same, but in the expression of it, This book is a book of sorrow. And we go through grief and we go through difficulties. And sometimes you can listen to someone speaking of their sorrow and their heartbreak, and it's full of emotion. And you can't help but be brokenhearted by what you hear. But this book gives it to you in its fullness. Not just the emotional pain, but the actual verse, logically, it's spelt out for us in this book over a death of a city. And what you find in the book of Lamentations is 5 chapters, and what's really interesting about it for you is this. It is the A to Z on suffering in this, because each chapter is 22 verses, apart from chapter 3. And what it does is an acrostic of the Hebrew alphabet. So it starts off with the A, the B, not that they have Z in Hebrew, but you've got the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And you have that in chapter 1, chapter 2, but in chapter 3, you have 66 verses, because it goes through the A, B, and C 3 times. So you've got 3 verses each for each letter. In the last chapter is 22 verses, but it's not so much the alphabet, because now the writer has run out of things, the expressions, the logic, but it's just the sheer fullness of this suffering that has been endured. And when people turn to this book, the Jew does turn to it. It's one of 5 books that they actually use at special occasions. And of course, in the history of the great calamity of their city falling, and for that time when they were driven out of the land in 586 BC, this book is there to remember. Now look, we all go through suffering. We all know of suffering in our life and in our experience. And I know that people will actually say they'll turn to this book and there's lessons for us to learn. That's true. How to suffer. The grief that we've got to express to God. But don't forget this lesson. That sin brings suffering. Sin brings suffering. And what happened to these people can happen to any country, any church, and any Christian who just plays around with sin. Don't ever think for a moment it doesn't come without effect. What I'll do is I'll read the verses as we go forth and then comment upon them. And what we have then, first of all, I'm going to say to you from verses 1 to verses 11, is now the condition and the state of then this situation that Jeremiah is writing about the city, Jerusalem. You see what you see in Gaza, totally bombed, utterly brought to the ground, desolate, death, all that. But remember what I read to you. Remember in Isaiah chapter 47, we will never be a widow. We will never be childless. We will always sit. We will never be bereft. People have this idea. They have it about the church. There was a time when they thought in this land that these places were here and they were built to last forever. But they're gone and they're being demolished. You need to read this. I'll just read it to you. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she who was great among the nations. The princes among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. And there's a lesson for you to learn. There is a pitiful sight that now Jeremiah beholds of the city. It's like a widow. And in those days, if you were a widow, you were helpless. That means that your wealth, your sustenance, your protection, you were utterly vulnerable. You were someone in grief and who is being bereft. But there is a lesson for us to learn. As he tells them, they went after other lovers. That's what they did. They were people who were among all her lovers, and now they are friendless. Remember, in the life of a church, any church which marries itself to the lovers of the world of this day will be a widow in the next generation. Remember that. It's what happened to these very people. And when it tells us, for example, at the end of verse 2, all her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. And when you live in this day, I'll tell you what church is like this day. Church is like community. We're all part of a community. And we now got community churches. And what a wonderful buzz kind of idea that is. But I've got news for you. When you collapse in this community, no one's going to fundraise for you like they do the swimming pool. No one's going to gather around you to keep like the leisure centre and the community centre going. When you're down, you're finished. Because that's not what you're about. You're a people for God. You're the temple of God. And you think that somehow being part of all this will save you. You're wrong. Your day will come. And if you put your faith in that, they won't bat an eye that such places like this are closed. And in their little communities where they fight for their parks and their streets and some kind of place, these places are in desolation. And so it was with Jerusalem when the time came. All the friends that she made, the political powers she was allied with, all the people she looked to for help, they dealt treacherously with her. And then look now what happens in verse 3. Judah has gone into captivity, under affliction, hard servitude. She dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her persecutors overtake her in dire straits. The roads of Zion mourn because no one comes to her set feasts. All her gates are desolate. Her high priests sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. And then you have something else sin always comes with a hard price and servitude. Sin will always lead you into bondage. I know there was a famous book in the Reformation, one of the 3 most influential books, and it was called The Babylonian Captivity. It was written by Martin Luther, describing the Catholic Church and all the sacraments that they had. A church in bondage, a church under servitude. So it is for these people, as you know, in the history of them, what took place was that they were taken into bondage and into Babylon. And then you see the effect of it in verse 4. Now, in the time of their history, there would be the feasts that they had. The Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacle, the Feast of Pentecost. And people would come to these feasts, the 3 great feasts, where people would travel the roads. And there would be days when that city would be overcrowded and filled with those wonderful festivals given to God. But now all that's gone. Have we not seen it? Have we not known of it? We've known of it in days gone by, where people made their way and the roads were filled, and the people came and they walked to places like this. And you had your Easter and your Christmas and your Pentecost, and they were high days, and it's empty. It's empty. Don't ever think for one moment that sin has no effect. And people say, well, why does all this take place? Well, we read of it here. And what happens to them then in verse 5. This is the reason her adversaries have become the master. Her enemies prosper. The Lord has afflicted her because of the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone into captivity before the enemy. Now read that. We're being told why it took place. Because of the multitude of her transgressions. Now the Lord is very kind to us. The Lord is merciful. He is slow to anger. He's abounding in mercy. You know, he doesn't treat us as we deserve. He knows our frame, that we're but dust. He knows every day that we commit our sins and we come to him, and what we do is we confess. But now the number of them, the transgressions of them, the overstepping, the dealing with him, constantly sinning in such a way, and so it is, they're children of God. Have you not seen what takes place? You know this took place, literally, physically, actually. In Gaza today, most of the population is a very young population. It's under real certain age. The great concern they've got is for those under 11. And they're being killed and wiped out. The children, they're gone. And we could say it spiritually. You say, where are the children? Where's that generation? You see, this has happened to these people. He looks upon the city. Surely you can make the connection. We're all a city. We really are, as a church and as a people. And all this takes place. Now look now in verse 7 or verse 6. And from the daughter of Zion, all her splendor has departed. It's gone, the glory. Her princes have become like deer. They find no pasture. That flee without strength before the pursuer. There's no food. They look for it. They're starving. And in the days of her affliction and roaming, Jerusalem remembers all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the enemy, with no one to help her. Her adversaries saw her and mocked at her downfall. And you do that. And they look and they remember of those days. It adds to the sheer pain and the sorrow of which one day was. Now, the interesting thing about grief is this, is that when you deal with people in grief, what they do is this, is that they just can't help but remember, no matter how bad that relationship was, how horrible it was. And I can tell you there's been some absolutely horrendous ones. But when you go in, they only remember this kind of wonderful, kind of idealistic kind of time. But it happens and it adds to their grief. Now look at verse 8, because it brings something to our remembrance. See, they've sinned. Jerusalem has sinned gravely. Therefore, she has become vile. All who honor her despise her, because they've seen her nakedness. Yes, she sighs and turns away. And in this version, it says about these people that that's what they became. They became vile. A number of years ago, when I was a student pastor, I can say it and I can name the man, because his name was Vile. That's what his surname was. I was in a student pastorate, and opposite the very chapel I was there was a church. That church now lies in ruins. Trees and all green and bricks which have fallen off. But it was open when I was there 30 years ago, opposite. And people from that church came over to the chapel. And this is what they said, and I never forgot it. They said the man stood in the pulpit, and his name was, he was put in prison in the end, his name was Vile. He was vile by name, and he was vile by nature. And they abhorred him. And these places, they become desolate with the vileness which takes place. We're living in a time when in churches they have drag queens to take services to try and attract the congregation. And people look upon it with abhorrence, and they can't even face what's taking place. These things took place in Jerusalem, in the vileness of their lives. And look now, the uncleanliness was seen in verse 9. Her uncleanliness is in her skirts. She did not consider her destiny. Therefore her collapse was awesome. She had no comforter. Now, O Lord, behold my affliction, for my enemy is exalted. The adversary has spread his hand over all her pleasant things. She has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you commanded not to enter your assembly. Now, do you see it? Sin comes with consequences. You're bereft, you're forsaken, you're childless, you're in captivity, you're burdened, you have no help. And so it is here, as he begins to speak of all the things that happened. And it says that in the sanctuary, because God has said, amongst his assembly, there's a people who should be gathered. And they come in, don't they? Do you know, I think over the years and things which God has prohibited within his sanctuary. On 2 occasions, and I know I could give many examples, I have stood next to a person in the pulpit who has been clearly drunk twice while funerals have been taken. I knew it was going to get bad. Totally gone. You think, this is just, how does it happen? We go through the whole service and no one seems to mind. It should never be. It should be out of the ministry. Shouldn't have a place in God's church. And then verse 11, and all her people sigh, they break bread, seek bread. They have given their valuables for food, they're starving, to restore life. See, O Lord, and consider, for I am scorned. That is the condition of the city. Starving and hungry. Now from verses 12 to verses 22, you have 2 things now, which we've been told now of the state of their contrition and of the confession that they make. And verse 12, we'll look at it tomorrow night, but I'll read it because it is perhaps the well-known verse of chapter 1. Is it nothing to you who pass by? But behold, see, if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which has been brought on me, which the Lord has inflicted in the day of his anger. We sang the hymn. All you who pass by, to Jesus draw nigh. So to you is it nothing that Jesus should die? Your ransom, your peace, your surety he is. Come and see if there ever was sorrow like this. And what happens in verse 12, we've got this contrition, which is now expressed by Jeremiah. It's like the city which is speaking. This is what she's like. It's something that we don't know today, of contrition within the church. I want us to just think upon it. Is there a place for it? And what you find now is that she speaks and says it's because of what the Lord has inflicted. Now, all the things that took place on the siege of Jerusalem, the rising power of Babylon, the armies that swept through, the political situation of the day, yet they say, the Lord has done this. It's just that acknowledgement. Come and see. This is of God. And when you see the place empty, as you do, this is what people tell you. Do you know why this place is empty and all these places shut down? I'll tell you why. It's because society has changed. Oh, great. Because people now are on their mobile phones. Great. Because people now have got, more money. Great. Because now, things are different. Is that what you believe, is it? Can't you see there's something more? The Lord has afflicted them. God has done something. He makes desolations on the earth. And you think that as long as we can do something with a mobile phone, they can fill a place? No. They understood. This wasn't just political. This wasn't just now a changing of generations. This was God. And he's done something. Look now in verse 3. At least they admit it. 13. From above he has sent fire into my bones, and he overpowered them. And he has spread a net for my feet. This is where they are. He's now confessing of then the place they're in, and turned me back and made me desolate and faint all day. Now that's what they are. They're in this place. Judgment is in their bones. They're trapped in a net. Every time they try and go forward, they're in retreat. We've known of it, the new experience of it. And verse 14, the yoke of my transgressions was bound. They were woven together by his hands. The transgressions, the sins, those things they committed, has bound them. He made my strength fail. The Lord delivered me into the hands of those who I'm not able to stand. And so they come and they speak of where they are. It would be good in this day that if the church could for just a moment just say, look, this is how it is. No matter what we do, no matter what we try, we're always caught. We never go further. Our strength has gone. We are faint. Instead of saying to ourselves, we can do something. I was only reading a report in I think it was either 89 or 98. I brought it out of what we need to do. And you think to yourself, well, perhaps something else is going on here. And so you find in verse then 15, the Lord has trampled underfoot all my mighty men in the midst. He has called an assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord trampled as in a winepress the Zion daughter of Judah. For these things I weep, my eye overflows with water, because the Comforter who should restore my life is far from me. My children are desolate, because the enemy prevailed. And so he says, God, the ones that he's looked for help, are nowhere to be found. I told you it was a pitiful dirge. It's a funeral dirge over the city. Zion spreads out her hands, but no one comforts her. The Lord has commanded concerning Jacob that those around him become his adversaries. Jerusalem has become an unclean thing among them. Now that is the contrition that they're under. But then in verse 18, what you've got is perhaps one of the most important verses for us to understand in this chapter. The Lord is righteous, for I rebelled against his commandment. Now what makes these passages so dark is that there is no glimmer of light in the 5 chapters, so to speak. What makes it so dark that in these Lamentations there is no justification of themselves. But at least in verse 18 they recognize this. The Lord is righteous. That is, he's righteous in his very being. He's righteous in his retribution. He's righteous in his law. Now, when you've been watching the things in Gaza, that's one thing that's not crossed your mind, is it? You never sat in front of the TV and said, the Lord is righteous. Never crossed your mind. Yet for these people, in what was happening to them, at least they came to know that God only does that which is right. And that's what you find in that story of Abraham and the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And although he never had the answer, he knew that God would do what was right. And the retribution that they're experiencing and the things that they're going through, they're the ones who have then experienced something of that. They've sinned, rebelled against him. Now, this is for everyone. Everyone. What happened here in 586 BC is a message to God to everyone. Hear now, all peoples, and behold my sorrow. I want you all to come and to see it and to look upon it. My virgins, my young men have gone into captivity. Now, think of that for a moment. Because he wants everyone in the world, all peoples, to see what God has done. It's a warning. What happened to these people can happen to any nation which turns its back upon God. Any church which plays and dabbles in the sin. Anything. Come and learn and listen. Because if God did something to his people, the glory of the whole earth, the place which were the people of God, come and learn. And this is what you've got in verse 19. I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and my elders breathed their last in the city, while they sought for food to restore their life. See, O Lord, I am in distress. My soul is troubled. Now here's the confession. He's making confession. My soul is troubled, my heart is overturned within me, for I am very rebellious. Outside the sword bereaves. At home it is like death. They have heard and I sigh, and no one comforts me. My enemies have heard my trouble. They are glad that you have done it. Bring on the day you have announced, that they may become like me. Now look at this last line in the last verse. Let their wickedness come before you, and do to them as you've done to me. For all my transgressions, for my sighs are many, and my heart is faint. Did you get it? God's done this to me. And the cry is this: do it now to them. You say, that's a strange cry. No, it's the cry which is right and which recognizes that God hates sin. And the Bible tells us judgment begins in the house of God. And because you can see it with your own eyes of what God has done and made desolation, He is a God who has no partiality. He says, now, this is what you do. Now you see all that wickedness out there. You do. You think, this is a strange book to go through. But it may be a book, I don't know, for us at this time. I'll just give you an example of what's taking place in our land at this moment. When places like this close down, and we're closing now one a week in this nation, one a week since COVID is closing down, right? These great buildings. And do you know how they close them down? Shall I tell you what they do? They have a decommissioning service. They want to do it properly and in order. So what they do is they have a service. It must be a very difficult service to take. And what you do is you get the number of people who are perhaps still left. The place has been a blessing in the past. Revivals have taken place. People who have come and remembered the great days, the good days, the days when they came and they came in their flocks to the services and conventions that they held here. And they come, and I've seen these services. You'll sing a hymn. You remember perhaps those days. You want to give people perhaps some hope and some strength. You may even let's have a Thanksgiving service to God for what He's done over all those years. Jeremiah has a funeral service which he writes the dirge for what takes place. I just wonder, would it not be better to read Lamentations chapter 1 and say something like this? This is what God has done. Learn a lesson of why it took place. Understand that there was something of His hand upon it. That we can no longer live as we once did and go the direction we once went. And that God's telling us in this very service, behold and see all you people. Because there's a God who does deal with sin, and it never comes cheap. That's just the lesson, I think, of the first chapter, dealing with the things of God acting in this world, and it is perhaps a lesson to us to consider. Now,